My name is Marianne Hanson. I am an Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. My area of expertise is in controlling weapons, especially nuclear weapons, but not only those weapons. So more broadly speaking, I teach in the area of international security. And by that I mean looking at the different dimensions of it, including how international law impacts on security practices, including strategic studies, in other words, things like national defence that states pursue, and then looking at the ethics also of security studies. And those I find come together quite in a challenging way when it comes to nuclear weapons and looking at controlling nuclear weapons. I never ever thought I'd be an academic. I didn't go to university until I was about 28 years old, because I grew up in an environment where nobody ever went to university. We didn't have books in the house. There were no role models at all. So in fact, I travelled for about 10 years after I finished high school. And that was the best thing, because I managed to go to so many different countries, and I worked and lived and met people, made great friends, did a lot of hiking. And that really sparked my interest in international politics. So it was a great way to get into the discipline, so to speak. And then I worked in libraries for a while, and I suddenly realised there's a world out there, there's this intellectual world which I had not been made aware of until, for me, relatively late in life. So then I thought, well, I've got to pursue an undergraduate degree, which I did, and from there I became hooked really on learning, and then was fortunate to receive a scholarship to continue with a master's degree and a doctoral degree at the University of Oxford. I then got my first teaching job after I finished my doctorate at Magdalen College at the University of Oxford. And I realised I loved teaching. I realised that it was just wonderful to be able to connect with other people who had similar interests and to learn from them as much as I would be providing structure and knowledge in certain areas. And after that, I went to the University of Queensland, and I have been there for quite a while now, about 25 years. But in between, I've managed to have sabbaticals in a number of other countries. So keeping that perspective of different regional and national views on international politics has been really, really good for me as well. I think good teaching often boils down to how we see our fellow human beings. At least that's what I find has an impact for me. So I guess I make myself open to my students, and I say, look, we have a fairly informal system in Australia, so it's a first name basis, and I tell students a bit about myself and my background, and I make it clear to them that in an area which is as contentious as international politics and, say, nuclear politics, that I will talk about my views and my preferences and what I feel would be the best kind of outcomes based on my reading and my knowledge, etc. But that I don't expect them to subscribe to the same views. That I'm not trying to tell them what to think. I want to tell them what to think about. So I encourage them to read widely, to question the sort of received wisdom that we get. And really, there has been such a lot of so-called wisdom that has been handed down over generations with regards to nuclear weapons, shall we say, which hasn't really been questioned. And what I do find interesting is when students ask questions and they do the broader reading, and they do come to, this influences their views over a period of time, and that's very rewarding, I think. In my classes, I've found that there have been times, well, in the master's course that I teach, which is on arms control and disarmament, we have a large group of students from overseas. So it's probably 30% Australian students, 70% students coming from other parts of the world. And that's really great because I get to ask them, how do you see the issue of nuclear weapons? How does your government see it? What kinds of things are important to the individuals in your countries? What constitutes security in your countries? And that can be, as varied as a student from Kazakhstan, a student in Texas, a student from Sri Lanka. So it's always good. And of course the other students benefit from that as well. Having that kind of international dialogue is really, really good. And then I'm also a believer in lifelong learning. I surprise myself by realizing that I'm learning a lot of new things all the time, and that's a great way to be, I think. Okay, I'm pretty passionate about this. When I did my master's and my doctorate, I did focus very much on the strategic studies side of things. So it was, looking at policies, looking at the traditional ideas of nuclear deterrence. And while I was never completely convinced that nuclear weapons was a good idea, or that they were a useful way of trying to seek security, I guess I took a more mainstream approach. However, the more I looked into it, the more dissatisfied I became with prevailing views about nuclear weapons. And in particular, once I studied the laws of war, international humanitarian law, and looked at questions of ethics, human rights, the impact of these weapons on human beings, on our environments, on things like food production, on climate change, it became evident to me that the disadvantages, profound disadvantages, because these are weapons which are qualitatively different to any other weapon that humankind has designed, right? That those disadvantages by far outweigh what might be seen as the advantages of having nuclear weapons. So all in all, to me, it was a cost-benefit analysis, and the cost, I think, is simply unacceptable. We're talking about the obliteration of millions of people and possibly of large parts of our planet as well. And deep down, I believe that really there are much better ways of seeking security than by promising to incinerate humankind. I remain concerned by the fact that the 9 nuclear weapon states refuse to move further towards disarmament or even towards providing certain security measures which would lower the risks of nuclear use. All 9 of them seem to be acting very irresponsibly, and we know, for example, that many of the hard-won treaties between Russia and the United States, or Soviet Union and the United States, have now been discarded. In fact, just about all of them. The START Treaty has been suspended, and this means there's essentially nothing that is holding these states together in terms of mutual responsibilities and addressing security concerns in a solid way. I find it really concerning that the trend today between these major powers is we're not going to talk to each other. We are tearing up hard-won treaties which would give us a little bit of stability in the nuclear world. And I think we're in a very, very dangerous state. It has been deeply frustrating and worrying to hear the threats, the veiled threats of nuclear use. And it's not just Putin, although that has been the most prominent example. In the war against the Palestinians, quite recently we have seen on 2 occasions Israeli politicians actually stating that they would consider using a nuclear weapon on the citizens of Gaza. And so to be able to make that kind of threat, now, okay, it's easy to talk. Whether or not they would go ahead is a different thing, I understand that. But to make threats like that, at which all of the nuclear weapon states implicitly do, and Putin most vociferously has done, is totally unacceptable.